Have you ever heard of a group so despised in the Bible that they were shunned, avoided, and even cursed? A people whose very name became synonymous with betrayal, division, and disdain? I'm talking about the Samaritans. But here's the twist. One of Jesus's most famous parables, the Good Samaritan, flips this hatred on its head. So, who were they really? Were they villains, victims, or something far more complex? What if I told you that their story isn't just about ancient feuds? It's about power, faith, and survival. The Samaritans weren't just misunderstood. Their origins hide secrets of political betrayal, religious purity wars, and shocking acts of defiance. Why did the ancient Jews hate them so much? Was it jealousy, betrayal, or something deeper? And what can we learn from this centuries-old grudge in our modern, divided world? In this video, we'll uncover the untold origins of the Samaritans, dig into the root of the hatred they endured, and reveal how their story still challenges us today. So buckle up. This isn't just history. It's a lesson for every single one of us. Let's dive in. Have you ever felt like an outsider, judged not for who you are but for where you come from or what you believe? Imagine a group of people living side by side with others who share the same God, the same ancestral roots, but are hated, despised as traitors and outcasts. This is the story of the Samaritans, a people deeply intertwined with the history of Israel, yet forever marked by division and conflict. The roots of the Samaritans take us back to the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. The mighty Assyrian Empire swept through the land, conquering the northern tribes of Israel and scattering its people. But the Assyrians didn't stop there. They had a policy of forced resettlement, bringing foreign peoples into the land to mix with the remaining Israelites. Imagine what this meant for the faith of the Israelites left behind. Their culture and religion began to blend with the newcomers, resulting in a people of mixed heritage. They continued to worship Yahweh, the God of Israel, but with significant differences. These were the ancestors of the Samaritans, a people born out of conquest, survival, and adaptation. Here's where things get really interesting. The Samaritans held to the belief that Mount Gerizim, not Jerusalem, was the true God-ordained place of worship. To them, Mount Gerizim was sacred ground, the site where Abraham once prepared to sacrifice Isaac, and where God's blessings were promised. But to the Jews of the southern kingdom, this was heresy. For them, Jerusalem and its temple were the only true centers of worship. The Samaritans' rejection of Jerusalem and their differing interpretation of the Torah, accepting only the first 5 books of Moses, fueled the growing animosity. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a clash of identities. To the Jews, the Samaritans were half-breeds, corrupting the purity of God's covenant. To the Samaritans, they were the faithful ones, clinging to the original truths of the Torah. The tension between Jews and Samaritans wasn't just a historical footnote. It's woven into the stories of the New Testament. Let's start with one of the most powerful examples, the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. In this story, Jesus shocks his audience by making a Samaritan the hero. Think about it. Jesus could have chosen a priest or a Levite to rescue the beaten man on the road, but instead, he chose a Samaritan. This wasn't just a story of kindness, it was a radical challenge to the hatred and prejudice of his time. Then there's the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. John chapter 4, verses 1 through 01, verse 26. Picture the scene, a Jewish man, a rabbi no less, speaking openly with a Samaritan woman, a scandal in itself. But Jesus does more than talk. He offers her the living water of eternal life. She becomes not just a believer, but a messenger, bringing others to Christ. The story of the Samaritans is about more than ancient grudges. It's a mirror for our own divisions today. How often do we judge others based on their background, their beliefs, or their differences? Jesus didn't avoid Samaritans, he embraced them, elevating them as examples of faith and love. The animosity between Jews and Samaritans wasn't just a petty feud. It was a deep wound that spanned centuries, rooted in betrayal, pride, and fierce disagreements about worshiping God. This hostility was so strong that even the mention of a Samaritan could provoke anger among the Jewish people of Jesus' time. The Jewish people returned from the Babylonian exile, filled with hope and determination to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. It's more than a building, it's their sacred connection to God, their identity as His chosen people. But as they lay the foundation stones, their old neighbors, the Samaritans, step in, not to help, but to sabotage. The book of Ezra 4:1-5, tells us that the Samaritans offered to assist in the rebuilding. At first it might seem like an olive branch, but their motives were far from pure. When their offer was rejected, they turned to treachery. They actively lobbied the Persian king to halt the construction, and they succeeded. This betrayal wasn't forgotten. It was etched into Jewish memory like a scar. But the division didn't stop there. While the Jews struggled to rebuild their temple, the Samaritans took matters into their own hands. They constructed their own temple on Mount Gerizim, declaring it the true place of worship. This act was more than defiance. It was a direct challenge to Jerusalem's religious authority. For the Jews, this wasn't just heresy, it was a declaration of war on their faith. Religion, as you know, isn't just about rituals, it's about identity. And for the Jews, their identity was bound to their traditions, prophets, and the covenant with God. The Samaritans, however, had a very different approach. They accepted only the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, as sacred scripture. They rejected the prophets, the Psalms, and all the writings that shaped Jewish theology after Moses. To the Jewish people, this wasn't just a difference in opinion. It was a rejection of God's revelation. They saw the Samaritans as heretics, distorting the truth and leading others astray. To make matters worse, the Samaritans claimed to be the true descendants of Israel, the rightful inheritors of God's promises. But their intermarriage with foreign peoples after the Assyrian conquest painted them as half-breeds in Jewish eyes, neither fully Jewish nor fully Gentile. They were viewed as a polluted people, unfit to stand among God's chosen. Under the iron fist of Roman occupation, tensions escalated. The Samaritans, often seen as opportunists, were accused of siding with the oppressors. Whether out of fear or pragmatism, they cooperated with the Romans at times, earning the scorn of the Jewish people who were fighting for their freedom. The Jewish rabbis went so far as to declare Samaritan food and drink unclean. This wasn't just a religious ruling, it was a cultural boycott. By avoiding all contact, the Jews were sending a clear message. You are not one of us, and you never will be. But let's pause here and ask, was all this hatred one-sided? Could the Samaritans have seen themselves as victims, not villains? Their temple was destroyed by the Jews in 128 BCE under John Hyrcanus, deepening their resentment. Every conflict, every slight, added another layer to the hostility. The hatred between Jews and Samaritans wasn't just about theology or politics. It was about pride, identity, and the human tendency to divide instead of unite. Sound familiar? In our modern world, we see similar divisions over race, religion, and ideology. But here's the lesson. Jesus' actions remind us that God's love transcends every boundary. In John 4, he speaks to a Samaritan woman at the well, a shocking act for a Jewish man. In Luke 10, he tells the story of a good Samaritan, making the hated outsider the hero. What does this teach us? That no matter how deep the division, reconciliation is possible. And in God's eyes, there is no us and them. Only His children, called to love one another. Let me ask you this. Have you ever heard of a faith so ancient and so pure that its followers refuse to change, even when it cost them everything? The Samaritans are such a people. Their faith was their anchor, their identity, and ultimately the reason they were despised. But what made their beliefs so controversial? Why did their practices set them apart, sparking centuries of tension with the Jewish people? Let's unravel their unique religious identity, and I guarantee you'll see them in a completely new light. At the heart of Samaritan belief lies their sacred text, the Samaritan Pentateuch. At first glance, it resembles the Jewish Torah, but don't be fooled. A key difference has set them apart for millennia. The Samaritans reject Jerusalem as the spiritual center. Instead, they declare Mount Gerizim as the true holy site chosen by God. Imagine this for a moment. In a time when the temple in Jerusalem was the beating heart of Jewish worship, the Samaritans dared to say, "No, it's not Jerusalem, it's Gerizim." This wasn't just a difference of opinion, it was a direct challenge to Jewish identity, striking at the core of their shared history. Could this one theological disagreement be the reason for the unrelenting animosity? The Samaritan Pentateuch doesn't mention Jerusalem in the same way the Torah does. Instead, it exalts Mount Gerizim as the location of pivotal biblical events, such as Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac. To the Samaritans, this wasn't just a mountain, it was the place where heaven met earth. Think about that. How powerful must their conviction have been to hold on to this belief in the face of rejection and persecution? The Samaritans didn't just believe differently, they worshipped differently. While the Jewish people celebrated their festivals in Jerusalem, the Samaritans remained steadfast in their traditions. To this day, they still perform sacrifices on Mount Gerizim during Passover, just as their ancestors did thousands of years ago. Yes, you heard that right. In a modern world dominated by technology and globalization, there's still a small group of people who carry out ancient biblical rituals exactly as described in the Pentateuch. Can you picture it? A small, devoted community gathered on the slopes of Mount Gerizim, the smoke from the sacrifices rising into the sky, the prayers echoing through the hills. It's a living testament to their unshakable faith. But why have they held on to these traditions so fiercely? Is it stubbornness, or is it something deeper? A belief that these rituals are the key to staying connected to God's original covenant. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Despite centuries of conflict, persecution, and even near extinction, the Samaritans are still here. Today, their community numbers fewer than 1,000 people, making them one of the smallest religious groups in the world. Yet they survive, preserving their ancient faith and customs against all odds. Think about the sheer resilience this requires. For over 2,000 years, they've faced exile, cultural erasure, and even modern skepticism, and yet they remain. How many of us would have the courage to hold on to our beliefs so fiercely in the face of such adversity? What keeps them going? Perhaps it's the hope that their story, their faith, and their sacrifices still matter in God's eyes. But here's the million-dollar question. If their faith has endured for so long, could the Samaritans hold a piece of God's original plan that the rest of us have overlooked? What if the reason they were so hated was because they refused to compromise on a truth the world wasn't ready to hear? I'll let you decide. The role of Samaritans in the New Testament, the Good Samaritan, compassion that shatters boundaries. Let's start with one of the most famous stories in the Bible, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Picture this. A Jewish man is beaten, robbed, and left for dead on a dangerous road. A priest walks by and does nothing. A Levite, a religious leader, also walks by and avoids the man. But then of all people, a Samaritan, a member of the group Jews despised, stops to help. The Samaritan doesn't just help a little. He bandages the man's wounds, puts him on his own donkey and takes him to an inn. He even pays for his care and promises to return. Here's the lesson. Love and humanity are not bound by religion, ethnicity, or social status. Jesus turns hatred on its head, using a Samaritan to show that true compassion comes from the heart, not from cultural labels. Footnote: Jesus and the Samaritan Woman, breaking all barriers. Now let's move to another shocking moment in Jesus' ministry. His encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well, John 4 verses 1 through 26. To understand how radical this was, you need to know two things. Jews avoided Samaritans completely. Men didn't publicly speak to women outside their families, especially not strangers. Yet Jesus does both. He sits by a well, waiting for this woman, and speaks to her openly. She's stunned, even asking, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" Yet, he tells her that he is the Messiah. Imagine the weight of this moment. A Samaritan, a woman, and someone with a sinful past becomes one of the first people to hear this profound truth. Not only that, but she goes on to share the news with her entire village, becoming one of the first evangelists for Christ. The message? God's love is for everyone. Jesus breaks down every barrier, ethnic, gender, and moral, to reach those who seek him. Healing of the Samaritan leopard, gratitude from the margins. Now let's look at Luke 17, verses 11 through 19, where Jesus heals 10 lepers. Lepers were the outcasts of society, and they lived in complete isolation. When Jesus enters a village, these 10 men cry out from a distance, begging for mercy. Jesus heals all 10 of them, but here's the twist. Only one comes back to thank him, and who is it? A Samaritan. Jesus says to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." This isn't just about physical healing. It's about spiritual healing. The Samaritan's gratitude shows a heart transformed by faith, reminding us that true worship and thanksgiving come from those who recognize their need for God. These moments with Samaritans are more than stories. They're a blueprint for how we should live as Christians. Compassion over division. The Good Samaritan teaches us to see beyond labels and love others without prejudice. Who are the Samaritans in your life today? The people you avoid or judge? Inclusivity and faith. Jesus and the Samaritan woman show us that God's message is for everyone. Are we willing to share God's love with people who are different from us? Gratitude and faith. The Samaritan leper reminds us to always return to God with gratitude. Do we take time to thank Him for His blessings, or do we rush past them? Modern lessons from the Samaritan story. The story of the Samaritans, rooted in ancient hostility and prejudice, speaks directly to this struggle. What can their story teach us about tearing down these walls? Imagine this: you're walking down a dangerous road, injured and alone. People who share your beliefs, your community, pass you by without even a glance. And then, someone you've been taught to hate, someone you believe is unclean, impure, stops to help. This is the story of the Good Samaritan, and it's one of the most radical lessons Jesus ever taught. Why did Jesus choose a Samaritan for this story? He knew the hatred between Jews and Samaritans was deeply ingrained. For centuries, they had clashed over faith, identity, and power. And yet, Jesus uses this parable to challenge the very core of prejudice. He asks, "Who is your neighbor?" And he answers, "Everyone." Think about the barriers in your own life. Who are the Samaritans in your world? Is it someone who looks different from you, worships differently, votes differently? What would it take for you to see them, not as an enemy, but as a neighbor? In the Gospel of John, we see another moment of profound compassion. Jesus meets a Samaritan woman at a well. A woman, a Samaritan, both outcasts in their own way. Yet, Jesus doesn't just talk to her. He reveals some of his deepest truths to her. Why is this so important? Because it shows that God's love knows no boundaries. Jesus didn't come to save one group or one nation. He came for all people. It didn't matter that she was a Samaritan. It didn't matter that she was a sinner. What mattered was her heart, her willingness to listen and believe. How often do we let conflict, pride, or tradition stop us from showing compassion? How many times have we walked away from someone because they didn't fit into our idea of who deserves kindness? Jesus reminds us, compassion is never wasted, and faith is not bound by labels. Now let's take a moment to reflect on what this story means for us today. The conflict between Jews and Samaritans wasn't just about religion. It was about identity, fear, and the human tendency to divide. Sound familiar? In our polarized world, we see these same divisions everywhere. Nations at odds, communities split by ideology, families torn apart by differences. It's easy to think that's just the way it is. But is it? The Samaritan story challenges us to reject division and seek reconciliation. Imagine a world where kindness replaces suspicion, where we focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. That's not just a dream. That's God's vision for His kingdom. And it starts with us. The story of the Samaritans isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror for our hearts. It forces us to ask hard questions. Who have we judged unfairly? Where do we need to build bridges instead of walls? And how can we become modern-day Good Samaritans in a world that desperately needs love and compassion? What about you? Have you ever experienced prejudice or shown kindness to someone others avoided? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge and inspire your faith. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you on your journey of love and understanding.